Over the last few years, it's become very, very popular to start training the hips, whether that be your glutes, hamstrings, hip flexors, or any other muscles that help surround the pelvic girdle. And for a good reason, as we have a lot of gym bros walking around looking like this. So today is going to be a guide on explaining to you how you could train your hips in different ways while hitting every single muscle group. To make this video worth your time, I highly recommend you get out a pen and a piece of paper, write down some of the exercises that you can't perform while you're watching the video. But with that being said, I recommend performing any of the body weight exercises that we demonstrate during this video to make sure that you get the best out of it. In order to learn and remember exercises and things that you see on video, you have to perform the action or take an actionable step to it. So make sure that you're following along in the video and that you're actually doing some of the exercises that I demonstrate. The motions consist of hip flexion, hip extension, where the leg goes backwards behind the body, hip abduction, the leg goes out towards the side, hip adduction, the hip comes in. Hip internal rotation is when the toes turn in and the heel moves outwards, while hip external rotation is when the toes move out and the heel moves inward. Hip extension is going to be caused by the hamstring muscle group, which consists of the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris, the glute maximus, the adductor magnus extensor portion, and all adductors when the hip is in full hip flexion. That's right. So when you're standing up from a real deep squat, the adductors are actually going to be helping you assist with that hip extension moment. Some exercises for hip extension will include leg curls for the hamstrings, single leg back extensions, reverse hyperextensions, any sort of cable kickback or banded resisted kickbacks, step ups or step downs, any sort of bridging or thrust variation, deadlifts, stiff-legged deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, squats, hip thrust. As you can see, there are more exercises that I can list in this video for you to try and to train hip extension. So your job is to get in the gym and try out all of them and see which ones work for you. Our next muscle group is the hip flexors. Now I find the general population doesn't train their hip flexors that much. And I feel the reason being is because you just can't see that juicy, voluptuous pump of the hip flexors that you get whenever you train like your quads or your biceps, your chest. You just can't see that. One hit some biceps. The main hip flexors we're going to talk about is your iliacus, your psoas major and minor, rectus femoris, tensor fascia lata, your sartorius, and then also your pectineus. Now, not only do hip flexors bring your thigh up, but they also work to help stabilize your lumbar spine, being mainly the psoas major. Hence, this is why training the hip flexors is a very important muscle group. They are very important when it comes to sporting performance, stabilizing that lumbar spine, controlling your descension into squats, standing up from squats, deadlifts, all these things. Hip flexors are important when it comes to helping to stabilize that spine and allow all the other muscles to create the force movements such as the hip extensors, the glutes, the quads, all these other things to help produce forceful movement. Ways to train your hip flexion is going to be a cable hip flexion, straight leg cable hip flexion as well is going to be a good one. You're going to do a seated end range hip flexion as well, straight leg hip raise over a kettlebell or some object, straight leg hip flexion raise off a bed, bent knee hip flexion raise off of a bed. You're going to do also a standing banded hip flexion march, and then even a laying down banded hip flexion march as well, like I'm doing on a bed here. You'll see all sorts of different ways to train the hip flexors. Don't forget to also train your hip flexors explosively for sports performance. And then also when you're doing hip flexion exercises, don't allow your back to arch excessively. Make sure you keep your pelvis tucked under and keep your rib cage kind of pushed down. Next up is our hip adductor muscle group. This is going to be on the inside portion of the thigh, and what it's going to do is going to bring both the legs together, and like I said earlier, it's going to assist in actually bringing you up from a deep squat on those heavier weights. It's going to assist with that hip extension. It's going to consist of the adductor magnus, adductor longus, adductor brevis, the pectineus, and the gracilis muscle group. So a very important muscle group that often gets very underlooked next to the hamstrings and the quadriceps, but it's going to help give you that nice, luscious, round look of the thigh, because it's going to add more muscle bulk onto the inside of the thighs as well. One of the first exercises that I have here is the lateral lunge with a slider, and it's the idea that when you go to stand up, you pull with the inside of your thigh, kind of dragging that slider as you stand up. That'll get the maximal activation of that hip adductor muscle group of the leg that's sliding out. Then one of the next ones here is my favorite. This is just a banded hip adduction. So any sort of band, any sort of cable, whatever it may be, is good to get that adductor lit up. And then another one that we have here is the Copenhagen plank. I like to do this as an isometric or just lowering the hips down like I'm doing in the video here and then raising back up while using that adductor group on the inside of the thigh. A pro tip when it comes to training adductors is that you don't have to dedicate extensive amounts of time to training your adductors unless you're recovering from a injury or rehabbing a strain. But the adductors actually gets worked a lot with squats and other big compound movements, especially if you turn the toes out slightly and spread your feet to more of like a sumo stance, so like sumo deadlifts, sumo squats, or just wide stance squats, things of that nature. So spend a little extra time altering your feet in the squats and all those other sorts of positions to get more adductor recruitment. Our next muscle group that we're going to be taking a look at is the hip abductors and also the hip internal rotators, because the three muscles that do hip abduction also perform most of the hip internal rotation, those being the tensor fasciae lata, the glute medius, and the glute minimus. Now, when it comes to training these muscles, they're going to be very important when it comes to helping control the hip, keeping it really nice and stable during squats and all other sorts of compound movements, explosive movements, and sporting movements, while also helping to keep the knee stable as well too. But it's going to keep it all stable so that those big prime movers such as the hamstrings, the quads, and the glutes are able to really focus on putting a lot of force production into the hips and the legs to increase strength, increase power, and increase force. Exercises will include cable kickbacks and cable hip abduction. As you can see, here's a cable hip abduction exercise here targeting that glute medius muscle. Clamshells are a good one I like to do on the bed. Prime good mover leading into squats exercises. These are your fire hydrants. I imagine you've seen somebody at the gym doing fire hydrants. Side plank clamshell, great exercise. Side plank with hip abduction raise. You can see in the side lying here, getting that lower one worked. This is a figure 4 hip abduction exercise. Regular hip abduction on the side lying, add a band for increasing difficulty. Don't do that. That's bad. Don't turn your toes out. Toes down, hip stays rolling forward. This one's hip abduction with a band and standing. As you can see, there's another example of what not to do with those toes out. Keeping the toes facing forward, leading with your heel. This is a standing hip abduction isometric at a wall. You're going to get the opposite muscle working. See, I feel it there. Then you can add a little squat onto that to kind of really work that whole. That's stabilizing the right hip. As you can see, I'm working that muscle to keep my pelvis nice and steady during the squat to control the knee. This is a reverse clamshell. I like to put a ball in between. That way you can get extra range of motion, working on that actual internal rotation of the hip. So this is actually internal rotation. All the other ones were hip abduction exercises. This is hip internal rotation with a cuff seated here. So you're working the same muscles with the hip abduction and the hip internal rotation. Could be some debate about that, but for our purposes, you're going to get a great motion. This is the band hip internal rotation and standing. So you're just kind of rotating while standing on here. Be mindful if you have a meniscus injury or something doing this exercise. Hip airplane is a really good exercise just to work all those stabilizers of the hip. The hip external rotators are going to consist of the glute maximus, the posterior fibers of the glute medius, the piriformis, the superior inferior glomerulis, the obturator internus and externus, the quadratus femoris, and the sartorius. So all these muscles are going to assist with the external rotation of the hip. I like to think of these guys as the counteractors to the internal rotators, and they almost act as the rotator cuff muscle group in the shoulder, helping to stabilize the head of the femur in the acetabulum. This can't be understated because they help to stabilize the hip and keep the knee nice and steady during sporting activities and lifting at the gym. So making sure that we keep the external rotators of the hip strong is going to help to increase your compound movements such as your squats, deadlifts, and even your performance on the field or on the court or wherever that may be in your athletic performance. Exercises like the seated external rotation with a cable is a great one to hit those small external rotators. Another exercise that I like to do is the standing hip external rotation with the band going around the opposite way as we did with the hip internal rotation. And then a seated on a bench. This is another variation that I like to do is the seated ones. You often have to move around a little to find the right spot in this exercise because it can be difficult spot where you feel those small muscles burning. I like to do a laying variation with a band or a cable, and then a laying off the side of the bed exercise. Feel free to strap an ankle weight to increase the difficulty of this exercise. Now we'll discuss a few ways to optimize your hip training for extension. So if you're using the extension-based training for performance, you're going to want to use heavy hip extension movements such as the deadlifts, squats, or a glute ham development extension that's weighted. Down below we have a sample sports performance workout that you could utilize to help increase your hip extension performance. And then when it comes to hip training, for building more muscle to increase force production or just aesthetics, you're going to want to utilize that time under tension principle that we've talked about. So remember time under tension when trying to put on more muscle and to build size of the muscle, and then fast explosive reps to increase the force production in a shorter period of time for sports performance. Don't forget about the importance of the internal and external rotators that we talked about, such as the needing for them to properly stabilize the hip joint. So without these muscles, when they're weak rotators, the prime movers are not able to produce the maximum amount of force that they can to increase your sports performance. And the adductors are often a very underlooked muscle group when it comes to increasing your squatting capability, especially in your deep squats when standing up from a heavy lift. They can often be a very underlooked muscle also in training for hockey players, so very important if you're a hockey player to train those adductors. Here's a more in-depth slide looking at exercises for each muscle group. What I want to focus on the most is at the top you'll see slow and controlled and lengthened position for growth. When it comes to growing any muscle, what you want to do is get it in its most lengthened position to stress it the most for the increased growth. So any exercises that put the most stretch on, say, your glutes, your quads, hamstrings, or whatever muscle group we're trying to grow, those are the ones you're going to want to hammer on the most. Glutes and your hamstrings is for their influence and effect of decreasing lower back pain, such as the glutes, hamstrings, and the lower back extensors are all parts of extension of the hips and the lumbar spine. If the glutes and the hamstrings are weak, then the lower back's going to be taken over to try to do a lot more work. So strengthen your hamstrings and glutes and watch some of your back pain disappear. The hip flexors will often get a lot of flack because everybody assumes that they are tight, instead of assessing and seeing if they are weak. Chances are your hip flexors are weak. I mean, think about the last time that you've trained your hip flexors. Probably never. So why would you assume that they're tight? Strengthen your hip flexors and see what magic can happen. So when it comes to determining the speed of your movement, your sets, reps, and intensity, you have to ask yourself first, what is the goal of your hip training? If your goal is to become more explosive, become better at a sport, chances are you're going to want to move faster with your movements. Although this will have less muscle growth, you're going to get more power production from your movements, get an increased neurological input from the nervous system when it comes to recruiting motor units for force production, and it's going to be greater preparation and carryover to your actual sport performance. When it comes to maximizing muscular growth, increasing the size of a muscle, this all goes back to that time under tension. So lifting with a tempo, like a 3-second down, 3-second up, putting more time under tension on the muscle is going to require that muscle to grow. It's also going to help you with connecting to the muscle and feeling it actually work. I hear a lot of times people have trouble feeling their internal and external rotator muscles work during exercises. Slowing it down and going for longer periods of time is going to help you feel the muscle actually work that you're targeting. Now, the caveat with this is that you can have an increase in muscle soreness because you're putting so much time and tension on the muscle. It can lead to more muscle damage, especially those lowering eccentrics. But what can happen is you'll have a decreased risk for injury with less volatile movements and more slow controlled reps as compared to the higher explosive sports performance training movements. So when it comes to the amount of volume and sets, when it comes to a growth, it's been shown that about 8 to 12 working sets per muscle group per week has been shown to be most beneficial. You can get up to 20 sets, but most studies have shown it to just be junk volume beyond that. For sports performance, that depends a lot on the intensity and how hard you're going, as well as other activities that you're doing. The heavier weight's going to be much more taxing on the exercises, so you're going to have to do less sets. When building a skill, such as like a snatch technique or a clean and jerk technique or something, moderate intensity is going to be your friend because you can still kind of moderate that technique some without it getting too sloppy. Around that 60 to 75% range, as you get more advanced, you can start to hit more like 75 to 85% range before your technique just kind of gets hard to focus on so much during those heavier sets. And just for general hip health, 8 to 12 sets will, again, be that good muscle building range, while also just keeping your hips healthy. Be mindful of the intensity and how intense you're going. If you're doing super high intensity reps going to failure on each set, you're not going to be able to make that 8 to 10 rep range if all you're doing is just trying to keep your hips healthy. And just know if you're waking up the next morning after your hip training sessions and you're extremely sore and a lot of pain that's lasting for greater than about 24 to 48 hours, chances are you're overdoing it. So optimize the amount of sets of volume that you're doing and how intense you're going to determine what's the most optimal amount of training for your hips for you. Is the weight. The intensity matters. So if you're doing maximal intensity, this is your 1 rep max deadlift or bench press where you're bleeding out of your nose as you're doing the lift. Chances are you're not going to want to go that intense for most people in the population. But a low intensity is going to be a very, very lightweight. This is going to be something like a lightweight bicep curl or something where you're just moving your arms through a range of motion. This is very, very light intensity. So when it comes to determining a weight for something like sports performance, a rough guide estimate is a weight that is something that you can move quickly and relatively fast that almost mimics something along the lines of your sporting speed. This is where we can also get into velocity-based training, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But generally speaking, there's a lot more nuance to the intensity when it comes to training for sports. So if you're looking for a specific advice on how much weight to lift for a specific sport, I recommend diving deeper into that in another area. But if you're looking for muscle growth, a weight that you can handle for 8 to 20 reps with good control and allows you to keep the muscle under tension for longer periods of time and achieve a full range of motion is going to be a good weight for you. Something that's tough, requires a good burn, and as you get to the very end, it's getting tougher to complete the exercise, such as you have only 3 to 4 reps left in the tank by the time you get to the end of your set. That's a good intensity for trying to build muscle. And then maximal force production and increasing strength. Lower reps with around 70 to 90% of your 1 rep max is going to be very beneficial for you. Needing to struggle hard, and it's got to be a difficult set. When you get to the end, maybe you got a couple extra sets in the tank, but that's a common theme when it comes to training yourself hard, giving yourself that stimulus to get stronger or to build muscle. It has to be challenging enough. This is where the intensity is very, very key. Last to discuss is the rep ranges. You have your muscular endurance, your hypertrophy, strength, and power. Now, these are not strict guidelines that you have to stick to when it comes to trying to train one or another. It's more of a spectrum that often overlaps with one another as well, and when the intensity also plays that really important factor. People working in that greater than 15 rep range is going to be working on muscular endurance, the ability for a muscle to work for long periods of time. In that 8 to 20 rep range is a great hypertrophy stimulus. So if you're trying to grow any of the hip muscles that we've been talking about, that's a great rep range for you with the adequate intensity. Strength is going to be about that 1 to 10 rep range. 10, you're going to be pushing it with strength, but anywhere on that lower side is going to be a great area. Power, about 1 to 5 reps, but it needs to be moving with maximal force and velocity that you can put into the barbell. Every single rep needs to be done with intention, and it has to move quickly. This is where that velocity-based training comes into. The only downside to velocity-based training is you have to purchase a piece of equipment that is able to read how fast you are moving a piece of equipment, such as a barbell or a ball or whatever your exercise is containing on that day. But velocity-based training is something that needs to be talked about in a different video because of how in-depth it goes.